Yeah, and the thing is, people are discussing whether this election will give birth to another dictator or potential dictator. I think that's the burning question here, Aris.
Right, right.
Hello, Nyambung people. Welcome back to the podcast where we can be clicked and connect. You can learn about new things, understand better on some things, and let's talk about social policies issues around us. Today, I'm going to get you clicked with the 2022 Philippine election. It's a presidential and vice presidential election that are going to be held on May 9th, 2022, roughly about 1 month from now. So it's very timely that we talk about it. It has been drawing lots of opinions because of some controversies representing some of the different political figures. So, of course, let's talk about this, and it's not appropriate for me to talk about this alone. Let's invite one of my very special friend, who is not just friend but a brother to me. And guess what? He is also a Philippine political scientist, an expert in the politics of the Philippines. Professor Aries Arugay. Hi, Aries.
Hi, Dr. Dina. A pleasant day to you and your viewers and listeners. It's a pleasure to converse with you with our upcoming elections, which is the political temperature here in Manila and throughout the country is getting hotter and hotter, as hot as our summer.
In Philippines, so when you say really hot, like, and the Filipinos say it's hot, it must be really hot.
Indeed, indeed.
Hot and sticky.
Right.
So maybe before we start, you should introduce your Instagram or Facebook, your sosmed, so people can also follow you, Aris.
Sure. You can search for me on Facebook, but I'm also on Twitter. My Twitter handle is Aris Arugay, just one uh, continuous continuous letters, and uh, you can also check the social media handles of the UP Department of Political Science, and as well as right now, I'm actually a non-resident fellow of the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore, where I do research and write on, in fact, the coming elections. So this is something
Yay.
that you can also see in the website of ICS, and it's a blog which is named Fulcrum.
Okay, excellent. As I said, he's already like a brother to me. We've known each other for decades.
Indeed, you're right. But it makes me feel old, but I don't feel it.
No, 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 no. We
Not
look
at
great.
all. And mutual admiration society here, my sister.
So Arias mentioned that he is part of the UP. UP is University of Philippines,
Mhm.
located in Quezon City, Diliman, Quezon City, Philippines, where he's now a professor. I admire you for that. Because he is younger than me, but I don't know what he does, or he eats so many papers. uh, we're going to talk about that part later, in the second segment. But for this part, we are talking more into the Filipino politics, yeah? So before I start, let me thank our subscribers. I welcome also the new subscribers and our loyal listeners for supporting us, liking the video, commenting, and giving me ideas on what's next should be discussed. And of course, by sharing this video to your community, we are also raising more awareness about social political issues around us. So I would love to hear your inputs. So please submit your thoughts. It will be a joy for me. So let's start the discussion. Arias, when it comes to this upcoming election on May 9th, Can you please explain what's the difference between these upcoming elections and the previous ones that Philippines had? What should we know
Right.
about this election?
Right. Okay. First and foremost, unlike the Indonesian presidential system, our current president, Rodrigo Duterte, is not liable for re-election because our president can only serve a single term of 6 years throughout his or her lifetime. So Duterte is banned from running under the current presidential system. So that's the first, I think, thing that I want to share. And second, similar to other countries, this will be the first election in the context of a pandemic. And therefore, just like in any other countries, we're anticipating some impact, although not very large, because at present, the pandemic situation in the Philippines is not so bad. Uh, at the moment, we are getting around maybe just 500 to 600 cases a day, and we are in the most lax alert level or restriction. And it seems like it's back to normal, with the exception that people are just wearing masks. That's the only difference. But as you may see from a quick Google search of election related developments, we have massive campaign rallies, massive turnout in a lot of political activities, political campaigning of politicians, and things will pick up in the coming weeks. You mentioned it's almost a little more than a month before the elections. The third is that I think this election is getting the interest of a lot of people outside, because historically Filipinos are always interested in elections. We love elections. I mean, we're the oldest country in Asia that adopted democracy and has had the most experience with elections. I think we've had direct elections, for more than 100 years since the Commonwealth under American rule. So Filipinos attach a huge significance with elections. For them, this is the only way to transfer power that is acceptable and legitimate. And this makes our voting turnout quite high. On average, we are around 70 to 80%. Developed democracies in the West sometimes only have 20% voting turnout, right? So Filipinos see them as important events, and Filipinos a lot of them need not be forced to go out and cast their ballot, right? You know this, you studied Philippine politics quite a bit when you were our visiting fellow in the UP Department of Political Science, right? But I think part of your question, Dina, is about who is running, right? Or
Yeah,
you'll get it.
yeah, and the thing is, people are discussing whether this election will give birth to another dictator or potential dictator. I think that's the burning question here,
Right,
Aris.
right. Well, because in a way, this election has really caught the attention of people worldwide because of who is running. And the current front runner, if we are to rely on polls, on surveys, is no other than the namesake and son of our very controversial past dictator, Ferdinand Marcos. And I do think a lot of people, very few people, do not know the name Marcos. If you remember, when Transparency International had a top 10 corrupt leaders in the modern period or of all time, the number one leader is former Indonesian President Suharto, and the second placer is our president and dictator, Ferdinand Marcos. So we're not really far behind. But we do have another president in that top 10 list. So in a way, we have two leaders. Joseph Estrada was our leader back in the late 80s. But going back to the Marcoses, it's quite unimaginable for some that you would have the son of Marcos running for president. And not only that, but seems to have a strong shot at winning. Because if we rely on the surveys, Now there's a debate whether to believe the surveys because a lot of people don't think that his numbers are that high. He's currently polling, some surveys put him around 51%,
Right.
which is a majority, but a more controversial survey actually puts him, the last month survey of Pulse Asia puts him at 60%. And then the second placer, who is the current vice president, Lenny Robredo, a female, and I would say the most maligned and criticized opposition figure under the Duterte administration, is only polling around 15 to a high of 19%. So there's this big margin, right? But one thing that I want for your Indonesian listeners to understand is that we have a different system. I know that in Indonesia, there's a process for one to become a presidential candidate.
Right.
Right? You need to be nominated by a party that is able to surpass a certain threshold in the parliamentary elections. And not only that, you have a runoff system, meaning the president needs to be elected by a majority. We don't have those two conditions.
Yeah, you have
literally
to be winner takes all, right?
It's one winner takes all. Yeah, one time plurality. So you don't. We never had, since democracy was restored in 1986. We've never had a president that has more than 50 plus 1% of the vote. Even Rodrigo Duterte only got 36% of the vote in 2016. So that means that if Marcos's numbers will be maintained, and if these are really the numbers, because when we do surveys, the question is, if the elections are held today, who will you vote for? Right? And a lot of people are saying this is not the same as really asking people who will they vote for on May 9th, on actual election day. But if Marcos does translate that poll number from 50 to 60 to actual electoral results, then you're talking about the first majority elected president under a winner-take-all system in our history. And that's a huge mandate.
Right.
For a son of our dictator who unabashedly is running on a campaign that is nothing else but bring back the martial law years. And I think this is why you were saying earlier that there's this idea that there might be a new dictatorship.
Yeah, I mean, it's maybe too strong, I realize, but I just want to put it up front here that that's a big concern from, being discussed around here. Would you think the fact that he is running, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., I cannot believe that's the real, the name really, really exactly the same like the father. Is it because Ferdinand Marcos Jr. or Bongbong is actually running with the daughter of current president? Is that what makes him popular?
Right. So you're correct. The vice presidential candidate, the tandem of Marcos is with President Duterte's daughter. And during the nomination process, meaning the last day wherein people can file their candidacy for those top two positions, Sara Duterte, in fact, didn't apply to be a vice presidential candidate. And she said that she's not interested in any national position. But this is a copy of what President Duterte did in 2016. Duterte, the father, didn't really actually declare that he's going to run until the last possible day it's allowed. He actually was a substitute for someone who filed in October of 2015, and then only in December 2015, with almost 5 months before the elections, was there an exchange with Duterte. Sara Duterte did the exact same thing, but for the vice presidency. And why do I say that? How do I respond when you ask whether Marcos's numbers is affected by Sara Duterte's popularity? Definitely, because we had surveys before, the earlier surveys, maybe September of last year, wherein Sara Duterte was still in the running for president. So you have Marcos's numbers and Sara Duterte's numbers, and Sara Duterte's numbers are actually higher than Marcos's numbers. So when Marcos was able to successfully convince, this is the theory, he convinced Sara Duterte to run not for president but for vice president and be his running mate. That somehow ensured that Marcos will inherit the support of Sara Duterte. So you're basically talking about the alliance of two presidential offspring, right?
Yes.
Uh, and not only just any other ordinary presidents, but these are presidents that have outright authoritarian tendencies. Two strong men, right? Marcos and Duterte, and I think that's part of of their appeal. And I think you understand this in Indonesia as well. Authoritarian nostalgia for the Marcoses, and we can delve about it, how what social media's role is and disinformation. But I just want to say that, in fact, historically, this is not the first time that an offspring of a president is trying to be president. Because before Duterte was president, we have Aquino, who's the son of Cory Aquino.
Yes.
And before Aquino, we have Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, who was the daughter of President Macapagal, the president before Marcos's martial law. So it's quite normal. And this is because, I don't know if that is also the term you use in Indonesian politics, but because in the Philippines, we don't have parties. Our parties are just uh, uh, alliances of political dynasties. And it's actually political families that dictate politics more than parties.
I think that's important for anybody studying Philippines politics. You need to read those literature in order to understand why people say political parties doesn't matter, because it keeps changing, but you need to pay attention to the figures. Now, maybe let's move to the point, or this question, whether people are actually enthusiastic about it. Is he, Marcos and Sara Duterte, creating some kind of anxieties among the society, or is this just us who already experience and see things before, who are
Right,
saying too much?
right, right. Well, there's historically there's always been resistance against the Marcoses, and there's always a segment of society who believes that they should not be given any space in the political dispensation or in the political arena. So therefore, a lot of those who believe in democracy, who believe in liberal principles like human rights, see the Marcoses, and especially the son, because his entire campaign is simply to bring back all the policies that his father put in place. And in fact, the greatest fear is that they will concentrate so much power that it will be like as if the Marcoses were ruling the Philippines with an iron hand. They're thinking that if they did that in the 70s, doesn't matter that it's already 2022, that they can do it again, right? Which for me is, you don't really understand how the world has changed since the Cold War, right? How but we also know that there's this global wave of populist strongmen that somehow justifies this type of politics. So I think the Marcoses will always face resistance. It's just a matter whether that resistance is enough. We see that there seems to be a concentration of that anti-Marcos sentiment with the campaign of the current Vice President Leni Robredo, who heads the opposition against Duterte, but also is seen as the more liberal democratic candidate. She actually doesn't come from any dynasty, but like Cory Aquino, she was also a widow of a quite famous politician who served in Aquino's cabinet in 2010. And she was unintentionally pushed into politics after her husband died of a tragic airplane accident. But Leni Robredo represents, for a lot of Filipinos, represents a polarizing figure, as you mentioned before, because those who are pro Marcos or pro Duterte thinks that she is the worst politician, but they couldn't quite justify it because she has never been involved in any corruption allegation. She has actually rendered public service at the height of the pandemic when Marcos Jr. was nowhere to be seen, and the only COVID thing he was able to do is to actually acquire COVID, right? But for Robredo, she has been maligned and a victim of the disinformation network and architecture put up by Marcos, and we would say the allies of President Duterte, that for now she has difficulty expanding her support base. But I think there's a movement right now. There seems to be a lot of people being convinced simply because she has presented a better, more detailed platform, and her claim is that I have the evidence to prove that I'm not just here because it's election campaign, but I've actually been rendering public service. I've been at the site of natural disasters, typhoons, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and of course, during the COVID-19 pandemic.
But thank you for bringing the attention to the other candidates, not just Marcos and Sarah, but also Leni Robredo. I understand there are also other candidates, right?
Of course.
Variety of backgrounds, from mayor to senators, boxers.
Right.
So tell us about the rest, and why aren't they as popular in the polls?
Right. So let's remember that because we don't have that nomination process and runoff system, then our entry to becoming a presidential candidate is a bit more open than in Indonesia. So if we rely on the polls, there are 5 major presidential candidates. So you already have Marcos and Robredo. The third in the polls is incumbent city mayor of Manila, the capital of the country. His name is Francisco, or his nickname is Isko Moreno, who used to be a movie star. So therefore, this is again cookie cutter Filipino politician, right? Celebrity,
popular figure.
Yeah, popular figures, right? And then the fourth would be, everyone knows him, globally recognized boxer, but also incumbent senator, Manny Pacquiao, right? You may wonder, why is he trailing when he's this famous figure, right? A lot of factors. One thing is that he was abandoned by actually his party, which is the administration party of the Duterte government. We called it PDP Laban. Laban is like perjuatan in Indonesia, like struggle. Right. So so that's my lame attempt at Indonesia. But what I'm saying is that Pacquiao doesn't have a lot of political allies, and I do think a lot of Filipinos, because he didn't really do well when he ran for the Senate. He did not place highly in we elect senators every 3 years, 12 of the half of the 24 member Senate. They're nationally elected. So when he ran, he wasn't really placing at the top of the 12 spots. I think a lot of Filipinos wanted him to just be remembered as an amazing boxer, and his amateurish stance on politics is quite evident. Like, a lot of people say he has the noblest intentions, but in politics, that's never enough, right? And the fifth is someone who wants to imitate President Duterte by he's a former police general. He used to head the Philippine National Police, but currently also an incumbent Senator Ping Lacson. He wanted to copy Duterte's peace and order, security, some kind of Jokowi-like peace and order, more security, iron hand policies. But it seems like that doesn't work as well because uh, uh, people have seen it and people have bought that. And when you're faced with like a figurehead, like a brand like Marcos, that seemed to be able to magically get some of those characteristics, and a lot of people, for example, see that if anyone who could continue what Duterte has started, it's not Lacson, it's not the mayor of Manila, Moreno, but it's actually Bongbong Marcos.
Mhm. So the front runner is technically Bongbong Marcos and Leni Robredo.
Yes, so it seems like we're headed towards that two-cornered fight, that the uh, one-on-one, me. But Dina, this is a replay. This is the second round of their battle for the vice presidency in 2016 because both Marcos and Robredo ran against each other in 2016 as vice president, and Marcos Jr. lost in that election. This
Right.
is the only election that Bongbong Marcos lost in his entire political career. And it was because of Leni Robredo. And but Duterte has not fully recognized Robredo, and this is why she has been ostracized from his government. She was fired from her cabinet post. She was given the housing and urban development portfolio. After a few weeks, she was kicked out from that, and she was never allowed in cabinet meetings. And she has been seen as an outsider of the Duterte administration.
You know, being president is not just about politics. You need to be able to network and being accepted also by different actors, including economic actors. So internationally, who do you think is more acceptable or more favored, if we can say, between these two?
Right. It might depend on who you ask, but Bongbong Marcos and the Marcos family actually has a conviction from a US court that actually prevents them from visiting the United States. So it would be quite interesting if you have if you have a Philippine president who is not even allowed to step on US soil, right?
It may
Because of a
change, right? Usually, once you're elected, then
well, you know what? It might depend because I tell you the truth, Rodrigo Duterte is the only Philippine president who has never visited the United States because his visa was also canceled many years ago before he was president by the United States. And because of that, he has refused. In fact, he has not visited a Western country at all in the 6 years that he's president. He didn't go to Europe at all. He went to Russia. Well, you could, but he never went to Western Europe. He also cursed the European Union, just
that's
like he cursed
interesting.
Obama, right? But Marcos, in terms of confidence in the economy, a lot of investors were surveyed, and Marcos was almost the last candidate that they prefer. They preferred Robredo because she only is not simply someone who has a detailed economic plan for recovery for the Philippines, because we had the steepest economic decline in Southeast Asia during the pandemic. Our recession was double digit, it was 16%. It was really a deep dive. When before we were one of the most dynamic economies in Asia, we were registering 6-7% GDP growth rate for almost a decade. But we had the steepest decline, and until now, we still haven't fully addressed and recovered from that decline. But also in terms of foreign other actors, Robredo has promised that she will um, invoke the arbitral award given to the US. Given to the Philippines after it won its case against China, and she is more towards having a more multilateral approach, meaning inviting allies, inviting um, countries who share similar values on international law, multilateralism, and the rule of law. Bongbong Marcos, on the other hand, um what has said that he would rather engage China in a bilateral diplomatic manner. And we all know the disadvantage of that, given the power asymmetry between China and any other small country that it wants to negotiate with.
Right. And it implies there maybe ASEAN would get more attention from Robredo than Duterte. I mean, Duterte and Bongbong.
Right,
Bongbong.
right. Because, it's okay to say Duterte too, because Sara Duterte is also leading the polls. She has around 53%, also a majority, right? So she is, because, but it's not yet sure. And this is why you see in the Philippines, because unlike in Indonesia, whoever you vote for president, you're also automatically voting for the vice president, right? We don't have that. We can split tickets, meaning I may vote for Bongbong Marcos, but I could vote for someone else and not Sara
As a
Duterte.
vice president, okay.
Right. And in our history, it's very rare that the president and the vice president came from the same ticket. It only happened once since 1986. It was in 2004 with Arroyo and her running mate winning. But Sara Duterte also right now, I think, is also trying to put her name in combination. So right now we have what we call the ROSA tandem, ROSA. RO stands for Robredo, SA stands for Sara. And Rosa is the Filipino word for pink, for rose, which is the color of the Robredo campaign. Right? So in other words, Sara Duterte might be playing this game wherein she is trying, she might be, it's harsh to call it betrayal. Is she betraying Marcos? But because her system allows it, she's very much open to being paired with other presidential candidates. Right?
Nobody else is who is running as the VP of Lenny at this point?
It's also an incumbent senator, Francis Pangilinan, who is currently polling third. The second placer in the vice presidential surveys is the incumbent Senate president, Vicente Soto, who is the running mate of Senator Ping Lacson.
Okay.
So Sarah's main adversary in the vice presidential candidate is the Senate president, Soto. I think he's polling around 25%, so half of Sarah's numbers.
Wow. So 3 individuals to watch for, actually, not just 1 or 2. Mm-hmm. And do you think there's a chance that Soto finally can become...
Can beat Sara in the...
Yeah,
it might be... Right. It might be difficult simply because Sara Duterte is really quite popular, and that has something to do with the popularity of the father. But Dina, I forgot to say that at this moment, with 4 to 5 weeks left, President Duterte has not endorsed any presidential candidate. This has never happened in our post-martial law history in the Philippines, because outgoing presidents often endorse a candidate. But Duterte, I think, is playing a hedging game. He doesn't want to commit because that's his hedge, meaning whoever wins, then he can say, well, I didn't really throw any support from anyone. But it would be easier for him to just endorse Marcos, right? Given that Marcos is running with his daughter. But he has refused to do that. And earlier in the campaign, he actually said some pretty bad things about Marcos Jr., who used to be his ally in 2016 when he was running for president. And this might shock your listeners, but among the things he said is that Marcos is a spoiled brat. Marcos is weak, a weak leader. He's a communist. But that's only the second worst thing that can come out from Duterte. He did allude to Marcos as being a drug addict.
Oh.
Yeah.
Wow, very personal attack, huh?
And for a president who's notorious for his bloody war on drugs, right? for him to accuse that. So, but he didn't mention Marcos Jr., but everyone knew because he said, oh, there's someone running for president who's a cocaine addict. He said like that. So, um, so in a way that I think it's part of his, for me, it's part of his distrust. He believes that the Marcoses cannot be totally trusted and should not be handed the presidency. Because let's remember, the last time this family had the presidency, they had to be extracted from power by people power. And they stayed longer than they were welcome. They stayed for 21 years. So this is why the fears that you were saying earlier that they're not totally unfounded. But because on the basis of history, unfortunately for the Marcoses, there's a lot of distrust even coming from authoritarian figures like Duterte, right?
And is it true that usually the younger generation, low age 30 and below, supports Bongbong?
Well, that for me, I think from the last survey, they did say that a lot of Gen Z and millennials, and a lot of the pundits explain this because, well, they did not live during martial law, and so they have, and they've been convinced by fake news and disinformation that this is the golden age of the Philippines, which is, of course, no, totally untrue. And on the basis of evidence and historical fact, the Philippine economy and the Philippines, in general, was not in a good shape during martial law. But I do think that the youth vote might be able to be. Some of them might be convinced to vote against Marcos, and because there's one thing that I also failed to mention, that Marcos Jr. has refused to even debate, to go on TV and debate with other candidates. He has refused. He said that the journalists are biased, or I'm busy, or I would rather talk to the people directly rather than engage in debates. And this has something to do with the way that he was ganged up by the other candidates when he was running for vice president in 2016. I think that traumatized him, and he believed that he will just be asked tough questions about his father, about the past, about the fact that he is a convicted tax evader.
Oh.
And because he failed to pay his income tax because he was governor of a province in the last years of martial law. And this is the, I think, the one that we'll figure out in the remaining weeks of the campaign. Our Internal Revenue Agency, the one that the Bureau of Internal Revenue, the one that collects taxes, has actually made public a letter they sent to the Marcoses that they owe the government estate taxes amounting to, don't hold your breath, $4 billion US.
Wow.
That's a lot of money, right? So that's
like
around
a slap on the face.
yes, that's 203 billion pesos. So now all the other presidential candidates have been using it in their campaigns, pressuring Marcos to recognize this and to pay up, especially because of the pandemic, because the debt of the Philippines, foreign and domestic debt, are of the highest. And Duterte has been saying, we have no money, we spend it all on vaccines and on the pandemic response. So now there's more pressure for the Marcoses to pay up. But here's the catch. Every court ruling asking the Marcoses to pay up in the US, in Switzerland, in the Philippines, the Marcoses has never paid. They refuse because they refuse to acknowledge court rulings. Because I think if they acknowledge one, they will have to acknowledge the rest, right? And the fear is that if he becomes president, that will all be erased.
Yeah. Wow. There are new things that you learn beyond what the media is telling you. So maybe my last question in this segment is, what can other democracies learn from the Philippines facing this 2022 election, Aries?
Right. Right, right. I can think of at least three. No? First is that uh, democracies, especially those with an authoritarian past, will always have the threat of authoritarian nostalgia because democracy is such a messy system, and democracies are never firmly established in the beginning, right? You know this in Indonesia and in the Philippines. We've been striving to better our democracy for almost more than 3 decades now, but we still haven't gotten to it because the struggle is real and it will be protracted. So the threat of the comeback of authoritarians must be uh, expected and anticipated. And I do think in Indonesia, you know what I'm talking about, because I think in your next electoral cycle, he may not be the son, but he's the son-in-law, right? And it's almost like we're on the same page. Uh, the second is the role of disinformation and fake news. That this is a real threat to democracies, and I think this is an this is a malady, a bad side of politics that we are seeing everywhere. That has allowed social media platforms not to be regulated and to just freely conduct their business because they don't really care about what happens to the countries that they're allowed to operate. All they care about is profit, right? So unless countries do something about it, social media will destroy the integrity of facts. And if facts are destroyed, then truth is destroyed. And then you can make up any kind of truth that you want. Finally, I think that what happens to the Philippines in terms of elections will have repercussions outside the Philippines. If a Marcos is put in place, that will have an impact in ASEAN, that will have an impact in Southeast Asia, that will matter because remember, when Rodrigo Duterte was elected in 2016, nobody thought that he could be quite an important figure in this strategic competition between the US and China. If we elected a president that was more willing to face China head to head, then the region would have been different, right? If we have a president that allowed more US presence or more presence of Western allies or other allies that will uphold international law and other principles, we might have a less aggressive, less powerful China than we have right now. So what I'm saying is that elections are not only domestic exercises that have domestic consequences. And I do believe that your upcoming elections will surely have an impact also in my country's foreign policy, in the policies of ASEAN, and basically in our regional strategic environment.
That's a strong closing, which I think should bring us all reflecting that the current situation globally, the competition between the major powers, should be part of our reflection. Every time we do the election, vote for someone, not only we have to remember the history and not to repeat the bad mistakes that we have had in our country, but beware, yeah? Whoever we choose, they must decide for the fate of not only the country, but the region. Because,
Definitely.
right, in ASEAN, we are not standing alone. We have other countries to bring together on. Okay, Aries, I think I learned so much from you. Hopefully, all the listeners also agree, viewers agree that not only our knowledge is enriched today, but if you feel like there's something else you need to know, you wish to know about the Philippines, please feel free to write me in the comments. You can write in Bahasa Indonesia as well. Feel free. And I can only thank you so much, Aris, for sharing with me your experience and knowledge about the Philippines politics.
Thank you very much again for the invitation, Dina, and I hope your listeners have a lot of takeaways and they learned something from their neighbor up north.
Stay safe, yeah, Philippines.
Sure. Stay safe too.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your support once again. Our podcast is available at YouTube and Spotify at Nyambung with Dina Praptora Harja. Make sure to send us your questions or your thoughts through YouTube comment section. And if you enjoy the episode, don't forget to like, share the link to your community, and subscribe so you make sure you don't miss our contents because we post every week.